It is believed that the year 793 AD marks the inception of what is conventionally designated the Viking Age. While earlier maritime activity from Scandinavian regions is not entirely undocumented, the raid upon the monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, has been generally accepted, albeit not without dissent in certain scholarly circles, as the symbolic beginning of sustained Norse external engagement by means of seaborne violence and opportunistic raiding. On the 8th of June, 793, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, immense flashes of lightning were seen in the sky, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed, and not long after that, in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, June 8, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, MSD, 793 entry. While certain anachronisms in this account have been pointed out, such as the mention of dragons and a theologically loaded narrative tone, it remains the earliest recorded instance, from an Anglo perspective, of coordinated Norse maritime raiding with lethal consequences. It is worth pausing to consider, however, that this raid did not emerge ex nihilo. The argument that Scandinavian piracy had already occurred along the Frisian coast in the 790s, possibly even as early as 789 AD, has been put forth by a number of scholars, notably Sawyer, 1991, and Richards, 2000. A brief entry in the Chronicle mentions a group of Northmen landing in Dorset in 789 and killing the reeve of the local shire when he attempted to escort them to the king's hall. This may represent an earlier, if isolated, instance of Viking activity. Nevertheless, it was the desecration of the holy site at Lindisfarne, once home to the revered Cuthbert, that shocked the Christian world. The monastery, founded in 634 AD and long a center of spiritual and manuscript production, was ill-prepared for a swift maritime incursion. Its coastal vulnerability, combined with the Norsemen's preference for hit-and-run tactics aboard shallow-draft longships, rendered it an optimal target. One must consider that the reaction to the raid, as evidenced by Alcuin of York's Lamentations, was not merely political but deeply theological. In his oft-quoted letter, Alcuin posed the haunting question, is this the beginning of greater suffering, or the outcome of the sins of those who live there? Epistola Alcuini, 793. This early theological framing is essential in understanding the wider European response to Norse aggression in the 9th century. While many modern viewers, shaped by post-Romantic reconstructions of Vikings as adventurers, may be tempted to regard such attacks as inevitable byproducts of socio-economic change, contemporaries perceive them as divine punishment or cosmic retribution. The broader geopolitical backdrop, often neglected in popular accounts, includes the internal fragmentation of Anglo-Saxon polities and the rising hegemony of the Carolingians on the continent. Charlemagne had, by 793, been crowned king of the Lombards, and was in the midst of his Saxon campaigns. It is perhaps no coincidence, as some historians like Coupland, 2007, have argued, that the Norse chose to escalate raiding activity when external Christian powers were otherwise preoccupied. Let us now, however, turn to Scandinavia itself in the early 8th century. Though our sources for this period within Scandinavia are sparse and often written centuries later, such as Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, composed in the early 13th century, archaeological evidence allows us to tentatively reconstruct the socio-political landscape. It was characterized by decentralized polities, known as petty kingdoms, ruled by chieftains or regional kings, konungar, with no overarching national identity per se. Climatic conditions during this period, according to paleoclimatic reconstructions based on Greenlandic ice cores, showed a modest warming trend. This may have marginally expanded arable land, thereby contributing to population growth, which in turn necessitated either expansion or increased internal conflict. Some scholars, particularly those in the so-called resource pressure school, have argued that this overpopulation may have acted as a structural driver for outward expansion. Others, such as Barrett, 2008, have refuted the environmental determinism approach and instead highlight the increasing availability of silver and prestige goods in the Carolingian and Abbasid economies. The hoards found in Gotland and Skane, including the famous Spillings hoard, c. 800 to 850 AD, which contains over 14,000 silver coins, are cited as evidence of a nascent bullion economy, connected to external markets through long-distance trade and raiding. It is therefore prudent to understand 793 not merely as an isolated flashpoint but as a convergence of spiritual, economic, technological, and environmental vectors. The so-called Vikings were not yet a coherent geopolitical force. They were, at this early stage, mobile bands of warriors and traders, often one and the same, engaged in opportunistic forays abroad, whose actions would later be mythologized, rationalized, and canonized in both native sagas and Christian polemic. Let us now, however, turn to the first century of external Norse raids and settlements, the phase commonly referred to as the Western Expansion. Let us now, however, turn to the immediate aftermath of the Lindisfarne raid and the ensuing decade of maritime activity by Scandinavian forces along the British and Frankish coasts. Between the years 794 and 800, a number of small-scale but highly symbolic raids were carried out by Norsemen, typically described in contemporary sources as heathens, heen in Old English, paganos in Latin, whose religious and cultural otherness was emphasized as a means of justifying divine retribution narratives. It is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle under the year 794 that, this year again the heathen ravaged the monastery at Jarrow, which had previously been associated with the Venerable Bede. The precise timing of this second major ecclesiastical assault suggests a deliberate continuation of the tactics utilized at Lindisfarne, a swift maritime approach followed by violent pillaging of religious sites that were lightly defended, spiritually significant, and often repositories of considerable material wealth in the form of liturgical vessels, reliquaries, and coinage. While the chronicle provides limited detail, later hagiographies and regional annals, such as the Historia de Sancto Cuthberto and Irish annals like the Annals of Ulster, suggest that the pattern of ecclesiastical raiding quickly spread to the western fringes of the British Isles. Notably, the monastery at Iona was attacked in 795, again in 802, and fatally in 806, during which some 68 monks were reportedly slain. These repeated incursions, especially those targeting monastic centers established by Irish missionaries, have been interpreted by some scholars as indicative of an emerging Norse awareness of both religious psychology and logistical vulnerability. It is worth pausing to consider the technological infrastructure that enabled such coordinated raiding activity. The development of the Scandinavian longship, characterized by its shallow draft, clinker-built hull, symmetrical bow and stern, and capacity for both rowing and sailing, was instrumental. Based on surviving fragments and later full excavations, including the Osberg, dated c. 820 to 834, and Gokstad, dated c. 890, ships, it is believed that these vessels could achieve speeds of 10 to 15 knots under sail and could be beached almost anywhere, allowing for rapid disembarkation and re-embarkation. While the precise chronology of ship design evolution remains contested, it is generally agreed, following Christensen, 1981, and subsequent maritime archaeologists, that the Osberg ship represents a ceremonial or elite vessel, while the Gokstad and Skuldalef finds indicate military or raiding use. The Skuldalef 5 ship, for example, measuring approximately 17.3 meters in length with room for up to 26 oarsmen, has been interpreted as a purpose-built warship. Its construction out of salvaged and mixed timber suggests both a practical approach to maritime outfitting and the prevalence of naval know-how within Norse communities by the early 9th century. The routes chosen by early Viking raiders also reflect a sophisticated understanding of wind patterns, coastal geography, and seasonal currents. While Lindisfarne and Jarrow lay along the northeastern coast of England, other raids during this period extended to the western seaboard. According to the Annals of Ulster, raids were conducted in 795 on the Recrew Islands, commonly identified as Rathlin Island, as well as on the Hebrides. These locations provided staging points for further incursions into Ireland and Scotland and would, by the early 9th century, become zones of Norse semi-permanent occupation. One must consider that these early Viking activities were not yet centrally coordinated nor ideologically unified. The term Viking itself, deriving from Old Norse Vikingr, possibly related to Vik meaning bay or inlet, was a functional descriptor of occupation, not ethnicity. Many of the early raiders may have identified with their local kin groups or edir, and chieftains, rather than with a pan-Norse identity. In this sense, early Viking raids should be understood less as national projects and more as entrepreneurial ventures, wherein martial prowess and economic gain were intertwined. It is during this period, c. 795 to 800, that evidence emerges for Norse contact with the Carolingian Empire. Frankish sources, particularly the Annals Regni Francorum, note a fleet of Northmen attacking coastal Frisia in 799. This incursion, though minor in scale compared to later campaigns, signaled a growing boldness in Norse maritime activity. Charlemagne reportedly took steps to fortify coastal regions, and there is some indication, cited by Nelson, 1992, that early Frankish policies of coastal defense were shaped, at least in part, by these preliminary Norse probes. However, it remains uncertain whether these early raids were carried out by the same groups responsible for the English and Irish attacks. The geographic spread, encompassing Northumbria, Frisia, and Ireland, suggests multiple points of origin. Based on grave goods and isotopic analyses from burial sites in Vestfold, Rogaland, and Nord-Trøndelag, it is believed that early Viking activity emerged independently from various Norwegian and Danish petty kingdoms. Let us now briefly examine the Norse home front during this initial phase of expansion. Contemporary written sources for early 9th century Scandinavia are virtually non-existent. What we know derives almost entirely from archaeology, linguistic reconstruction, and later saga literature, which must be treated with caution. Settlement patterns, as evidenced by excavation at Borg in Lofoten and Koppang in Vestfold, suggest the presence of high-status farmsteads with regional influence. These would later evolve into the power bases of kings like Harald Fairhair in the mid-9th century. Socially, the Norse operated within a chieftain-based system with limited central authority, wherein loyalty was largely personal and contractual. Honor-based economies, gift-giving networks, and martial retainers, or herdmen, formed the basis of power. The decision to raid or trade was not mutually exclusive, and early expeditions often involved both activities. To conclude this segment, the years 793 to 800 represent not merely the beginning of Norse raiding activity abroad but the surfacing of a complex maritime culture in Scandinavia, driven by local chieftains, facilitated by naval innovation, and emboldened by weak coastal defenses and Christian polities. While small in scale, these early raids established logistical routes, generated local prestige, and, perhaps most importantly, demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most sacred Christian sites to foreign attack. Let's now examine the expansion and consolidation of Norse influence in the British Isles and Francia during the 9th century, a time characterized by the arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army. Let us now, however, turn to the third quarter of the 9th century, wherein the Viking phenomenon, once defined by small-scale, coastal raiding, underwent a marked transformation. It is in this period, beginning in the year 865 AD, that the sources record the arrival of what was referred to as the Mythology, or Great Army, a coalition of Norse warriors who began not merely to raid, but to conquer and overwinter in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides the earliest and most sustained narrative of this development. In its entry for the year 865, it is stated that a great heathen army came to England and took up winter quarters in East Anglia. There, they were said to have been supplied with horses, presumably in exchange for peace or as part of negotiated tribute. The leadership of this army, according to later saga literature and corroborated in part by Irish annals, was attributed to Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ub, figures who, in saga literature, are presented as sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, although historians remain divided as to their historical identities. It is worth pausing to consider that the term, Great Army, does not necessarily imply overwhelming numerical superiority. Estimates vary widely. Sawyer, 1982, proposed a force of several hundred to perhaps a few thousand warriors, whereas later authors such as Hadley, 2001, suggest that the army may have fluctuated in size, expanding and contracting as it absorbed local recruits and reinforcements from Scandinavia. Nevertheless, the mobility and endurance of this army were unprecedented in the Anglo-Saxon context. In 866, the Great Army captured York, the principal city of the Northumbrians. The internal divisions within the Northumbrian elite, namely the conflict between rival kings Osbert and Aella, were exploited by the Norse. Both kings were reportedly killed in the siege, and the city became a Norse stronghold, referred to later as Jorvik. The chronicle continues, in 867 the army moved south into Mercia, capturing Nottingham, and in 869 to 870 turned its attention to East Anglia. The death of King Edmund of East Anglia, later canonized as Saint Edmund, is reported in both Latin hagiographies and the Chronicle. He was allegedly captured, tortured, and martyred for refusing to renounce Christianity. The Norse, having eliminated significant resistance, established themselves as de facto rulers of the region. The concept of overwintering, while seemingly mundane, represented a strategic evolution in Norse military practice. Earlier raiders had generally returned to Scandinavia after the summer season. Now, fortified winter camps, referred to in the sources as hibernacula or simply as winter quarters, allowed for year-round campaigning and occupation. Excavations at Torksey in Lincolnshire and Repton in Derbyshire have uncovered Norse encampments dating to precisely this period, including mass graves, weapons, coins, and domestic refuse indicating extended habitation. It is from these bases that the Norse launched further offensives into Mercia and Wessex. However, they encountered more organized resistance in the south. In 871, the Battle of Ashdown was fought against the forces of Athelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred. Though indecisive, the engagements of that year culminated in a truce. It was not until Alfred's military reforms and the creation of fortified baths that Wessex would begin to successfully repel Viking advances. By the 880s, the political landscape had changed. Alfred had become King of Wessex and signed what has come to be known as the Treaty of Wedmore with Guthrum, the Norse leader who had converted to Christianity and adopted the baptismal name Athelstan. The treaty is preserved in later manuscript tradition, notably in Textus Rufensis, and though its authenticity is debated, it delineates a boundary between Anglo-Saxon and Norse-held territories, establishing what would become known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw, as defined by the legal terminology of the 11th century, encompassed much of northern and eastern England, Northumbria, East Anglia, and parts of Mercia. The term does not refer to a specific polity, but rather to a jurisdiction under which Danish law and custom were recognized. Place name evidence, especially the prevalence of by, farmstead, and thorp, village, attests to substantial Norse settlement. Towns such as Grimsby, Derby, and Whitby retain these linguistic imprints. It is worth noting that the Danelaw was not simply an area of conquest, it was also a zone of cultural fusion. Recent bioarchaeological analyses of skeletal remains from burial sites such as Heath Wood and Repton show mixed dietary signatures and grave customs. Some graves were furnished with Scandinavian grave goods, others were indistinguishable from Anglo-Saxon Christian burials. This suggests either intermarriage or a gradual acculturation process. One must consider, therefore, that the legacy of the Great Heathen Army was not solely military. It inaugurated a new phase in Viking activity characterized by permanent settlement, landholding, and, in some cases, local rule. Norse rulers such as Guthrum in East Anglia and Halfdan in Northumbria minted coins in their own names, some bearing Christian symbols, others invoking Thor's hammer, indicative of a hybrid cultural and economic landscape. The establishment of Norse-controlled zones in England altered not only the geopolitical map but also the legal and economic structures of early medieval Britain. The laws of Edward and Guthrum, a 10th-century code likely based on earlier practices, demonstrate attempts to reconcile differing legal customs under a unified framework. Trade increased between Norse and Anglo-Saxon towns, and evidence of Scandinavian-style weights and measures emerges in market centers like Stamford and Thetford. We should now shift our focus to the simultaneous developments beyond England, particularly in Ireland and the North Atlantic, where Norse influence was starting to take root through both raiding and settlement. Now turning away from the English mainland to consider the simultaneous expansion of Norse influence in Ireland, Scotland, and the North Atlantic, a movement that began as sporadic raiding in the late 8th century and evolved, over the course of the 9th, into permanent settlement and political integration. It is within these zones of peripheral colonization that some of the most enduring Viking legacies, linguistic, genetic, and cultural, would take root. The earliest raids in Ireland are recorded in the Irish Annals, particularly the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of the Four Masters. The year 795 is conventionally cited as the commencement of Norse activity, with attacks on Rathlin Island, the Inishmurray Monastery, and possibly Lambay Island. These coastal monastic sites, like their counterparts in Northumbria, were vulnerable and poorly defended, often housing silver relics and cattle herds. By the 820s and 830s, the frequency of Norse incursions had increased dramatically. According to the Annals of Ulster, the year 837 witnessed a major escalation. A fleet of 60 ships came up the River Liffey, and another of 60 ships entered the Boyne, indicating both a logistical capacity and a strategic shift toward inland penetration. These fleets likely consisted of shallow-draft longships, capable of navigating estuarine waters deep into Irish territory. It is worth pausing to consider the term Longfort, which begins to appear in annalistic entries around this period. The word refers to a semi-permanent Viking encampment or base, often situated at river mouths. The Longfort at Dublin, established circa 841, represents the most well-documented example. Excavations in the area surrounding present-day Wood Quay have uncovered evidence of continuous Norse occupation throughout the 9th century, including post-and-wattle housing structures, ironworking debris, imported pottery, and coin hoards. Dublin would eventually develop into the principal Norse kingdom in Ireland, ruled by a line of Scandinavian kings beginning with Olaf the White around 853. His alliance with the Scottish king Constantine I and later opposition to the Ui Neil dynasties reveals the complexity of Norse-Irish political entanglements. It was not simply a matter of Norse versus native, alliances were fluid, shifting with dynastic interests and trade incentives. Similar patterns of Norse integration occurred in Scotland, particularly in the Northern and Western Isles. The Orkneys and Shetlands, collectively known in Old Norse as Norwegiar, appear to have been settled from Norway during the early 9th century. The Orkneyinga saga, though written in the early 13th century, attributes their conquest to a figure known as Earl Sigurd, allegedly acting on behalf of King Harald Fairhair of Norway. Historians remain uncertain as to the historical basis of this narrative, though archaeological evidence of Norse-style burials and farms throughout the archipelago supports a widespread and enduring Scandinavian presence. The Western Isles, also referred to as the Hebrides or Shurijar, follow a similar trajectory. Irish and Norse annals alike report Viking activity in these islands from as early as 790, with intensified raiding in the 820s and 830s. Settlement patterns, based on excavations at sites such as Bornay and Udal, show a fusion of native Gaelic and Norse material culture, including hybridized forms of pottery, ringed pins, and mixed linguistic elements in personal names. Now let's turn briefly to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, what scholars often classify as the North Atlantic Zone of Viking expansion. While these areas were far removed from the political centers of England or Ireland, they played a critical role in Norse colonization narratives and in the later saga tradition. According to the Islendingabok and the Landnámabók, the settlement of Iceland began around 870 AD, spearheaded by Norwegian chieftains fleeing the consolidation of royal power under Harald Fairhair. The historicity of this account remains debated. While the saga tradition emphasizes political exile, modern scholars such as Bayok, 2001, argue that economic opportunity and overpopulation were more plausible drivers. The first permanent settler, according to tradition, was Ingolfur Arnarsson, who established his homestead in Reykjavik around 874. Archaeological findings in the Reykjavik region, including turf house remains and early Christian graves, support a settlement date in the late 9th century, though recent radiocarbon analysis suggests the possibility of pre-Norse activity, perhaps Celtic hermits or seasonal visitors. It is worth pausing to note that Iceland developed without the overt conquest and native displacement seen in the British Isles. The island was largely uninhabited, save for isolated anchorite communities. Thus, Norse society was transplanted with remarkable fidelity. The settlers brought with them not only livestock and tools but also legal traditions, such as the Thing assembly system, which culminated in the establishment of the Althing at Ingvellir in 930 AD, widely regarded as the oldest surviving parliament in the world. Greenland, by contrast, was settled later, and under different circumstances. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Eric, having been exiled from Iceland, sailed westward and established two colonies, the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq, and the western settlement near Nuuk, around the year 985. These settlements, though remote and fragile, persisted for several centuries. Excavations at Brattle have revealed church sites, turf houses, and animal enclosures, indicating a mixed subsistence economy centered on pastoralism and limited agriculture. The success of these North Atlantic colonies depended on maritime connectivity with Norway and Iceland, and to some extent, with continental Europe. Walrus ivory, exported from Greenland, became a luxury item in European markets. However, the settlements ultimately declined, due in part to climatic cooling, soil degradation, and possibly conflict with Inuit populations, though direct evidence for such conflict remains scarce. Now we briefly address the broader significance of Norse expansion in the Atlantic context. The Norse were the first known Europeans to reach North America, as recounted in the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson is said to have landed in a region he called Vinland. The only confirmed Norse site in North America is at L'Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland, dated to around 1000 AD. Though short-lived, the expedition marks the furthest known reach of Viking exploration. To conclude this segment, the Norse presence in Ireland, Scotland, and the North Atlantic was not merely a series of raiding expeditions but a far-reaching colonial endeavor, involving permanent settlement, political realignment, and the establishment of new societies in marginal environments. These developments occurred in tandem with, and sometimes independently of, events in England and Francia, demonstrating the decentralized yet expansive nature of Viking Age mobility. Now we're going to have a deep dive into the emerging state structures within Scandinavia itself, particularly the consolidation of petty kingdoms into larger polities under figures such as Harald Fairhair and Gorm the Old. Turning inward, toward Scandinavia itself, we see that the process of kingdom formation, once scattered and loosely organized, began to coalesce into more centralized structures during the 9th and 10th centuries. Contrary to the popular image of the Viking Age as one defined solely by overseas raiding, it is essential to acknowledge the gradual consolidation of political authority within the Norse homelands. This period, shaped by regional rivalries, dynastic assertions, and evolving systems of governance, laid the foundations for Norway and Denmark's first recognizable monarchies. We begin with Norway, a land defined by its fjords, rugged coastlines, and fiercely autonomous local leaders. According to the Heimskringla, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, but drawing on older oral traditions, the unification of Norway is attributed to Harald Halfdan, better known as Harald Fairhair. He is said to have vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he ruled all of Norway, a gesture both symbolic and likely apocryphal. The historicity of this unification remains debated. Snorri places the decisive moment at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, dated around 872, but no contemporary written evidence confirms the event. Archaeological findings at sites such as Borg in Lofoten and Evaldsens in Rogaland, however, indicate the presence of elite centers marked by rich burials, boathouses, and imported luxury goods. While Harald's authority likely did not extend across all of modern Norway, his influence in regions like Hordaland and Vestfold was likely substantial. One must also consider Norway's challenging geography. Its fjords and mountains often hindered centralized rule. Political power was built on networks of loyalty, martial prowess, and wealth distribution. Assemblies, known as things, played crucial roles in local governance. Kings depended on regional magnates for support, and negotiation was often more effective than coercion. By the late 900s, Norway came under the rule of Haakon the Good, Harald Fairhair's son, raised in the court of Athelstan of England. Haakon attempted to introduce Christianity to Norway but faced strong resistance from traditionalist chieftains. His reign reveals how political consolidation and religious transformation often intersected, setting patterns that would continue into the next century. Turning next to Denmark, the movement toward royal centralization was somewhat more advanced. The earliest historically identifiable king is Gorm the Old, who ruled in the early to mid-10th century. Based on the Jelling stones and the writings of Adam of Bremen, Gorm controlled much of Jutland and Zealand. His son, Harald Gormson, better known as Harald Bluetooth, would emerge as a defining figure in Danish history. The Jelling complex, which includes 2 large burial mounds, a church, and runestones, serves as both archaeological and political testimony. The larger runestone, often called Denmark's birth certificate, claims Harald won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. While the extent of his rule over Norway is debatable, this monument reflects both territorial ambition and religious intent. Harald Bluetooth's reign also marked infrastructural and military innovation. He is credited with constructing a series of circular fortresses, so-called Trelleborg-type ring forts, at strategic sites such as Aggersborg, Furket, and Trelleborg. Their uniformity and planning suggest strong central authority, prompting scholars to argue for an emerging state apparatus in Denmark by the late 10th century. Christianization was central to this process. Harald's conversion, possibly under pressure from Otto I of the Holy Roman Empire, is noted in Adam of Bremen's Gesta Hamburgensis. Some historians view the conversion as politically expedient, granting access to imperial alliances and Christian trade routes. Others suggest a slower, more uneven adoption, especially outside urban areas. Harald's later reign was marred by internal strife. His son, Sven Forkbeard, eventually rebelled and overthrew him, possibly with German support. This event highlights the fragility of early monarchies, where power often rested on volatile alliances and contested legitimacy. Shifting our attention to Sweden, the least centralized of the three, we encounter a more ambiguous narrative. Unlike Norway and Denmark, Sweden lacks a clear saga tradition of unification. Our primary source, Adam of Bremen, writing in the late 11th century, portrays Sweden from an outsider's Christian perspective. He describes the temple at Uppsala as a center of religious and political life, where human and animal sacrifices were made. Kings such as Eric the Victorious and Olaf Skotkonung are associated with this region. Archaeological evidence at Gamla Uppsala confirms the presence of royal burial mounds, feasting halls, and cultic buildings. Olaf Skotkonung, ruling around 995 to 1022, is recognized as Sweden's first Christian king. He minted coins with Christian symbols and established contact with the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen. Yet as in Norway, Christianity's full penetration into rural life would take generations. To summarize this segment, the 9th and 10th centuries saw the emergence of kingdoms in Scandinavia. These developments were uneven, shaped by local traditions, external pressures, and the entanglement of politics and religion. The resulting monarchies, still fragile and negotiated, would become the foundations for later medieval states. Turning our attention eastward, we encounter a region often sidelined in popular Viking narratives, but one of deep economic and political significance. Along the river systems of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Scandinavian traders and warriors, known collectively as the Varangians, established far-reaching trade networks, built settlements, and laid the foundations for what would become the polity of Kievan Rus. The term Varangian, from the Old Norse Varingi, meaning sworn companion, was adopted by Byzantine sources to refer to Norsemen serving as mercenaries or traders. In Eastern Slavic chronicles, these Norse figures were referred to as the Rus, a term of contested etymology. It may derive from the Finnish ruotsi, meaning Sweden, or perhaps from a Proto-Germanic word for rowing. While the origin remains debated, most historians agree the early Rus elite were of Scandinavian descent. By the early 9th century, Norse groups from Sweden, referred to in Latin and Norse sources as the Sphere, began exploiting river routes such as the Folkhof, Dnieper, and Volga. Their goal was not conquest in the Western European sense, but commerce. These rivers provided access to lucrative markets in Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. This trade corridor is sometimes called the Silver Way, linking the Baltic Sea to the Islamic world. Arabic geographers and emissaries provide vivid testimony. Ibn Khordadbeh, writing in the mid-9th century, describes Norse merchants, whom he calls Aurus, traveling to Baghdad via the Volga, bearing furs, slaves, and swords. In exchange, they acquired Islamic silver dirhams. These coins, minted by the Abbasids and Samanids, have been unearthed in vast numbers across Scandinavia. Over 100,000 have been found in Sweden alone. Among these finds, the Spillings hoard, discovered on Gotland in 1999, contains over 14,000 silver coins, most of Middle Eastern origin. Such evidence suggests a highly developed trade system, one facilitated by Norse nautical skill and cultural adaptability. The traditional founding of the Rus state is attributed to Rurik, a semi-legendary chieftain said to have settled at Novgorod around 862. According to the primary chronicle, compiled by Kievan monks in the early 12th century, the local Slavic tribes invited the Varangians to bring order to their land. This story, while likely constructed as a later justification for foreign rule, reflects a remembered moment of Norse political ascendancy. Archaeological remains at Staraya Ladiga and Novgorod, including longhouses, imported goods, and Scandinavian-style graves, confirm early Norse presence in the region. The consolidation of this power base continued under Oleg of Novgorod, who captured Kiev in 882. He declared it the mother of Rus cities, establishing it as the nucleus of the Kievan polity. In the early 10th century, Oleg's successors, engaged in both warfare and diplomacy, negotiated treaties with Byzantium. Agreements dated 907 and 911 regulated trade, outlined legal protections, and facilitated diplomatic relations. These accords, recorded in the primary chronicle, reflect the growing political sophistication of the Rus rulers. We pause here to examine the extraordinary account of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an emissary of the Abbasid Caliphate who encountered a Rus group on the Volga in 922. His description, preserved in fragments, offers a detailed ethnographic glimpse into Norse life on the eastern frontier. He writes of tall, tattooed men, elaborately adorned women, and ships laden with furs and slaves. His most memorable passage recounts a chieftain's funeral. The deceased was laid in a ship, surrounded by ritual offerings. A slave girl, reportedly willing, was strangled and stabbed before being laid beside him and set ablaze. Though debated for its accuracy, this account underscores the rich ceremonial life of Norse elites abroad. By the mid-10th century, Christianity began to penetrate the Rus, not from Scandinavia, but via Byzantine influence. Princess Olga of Kiev converted during a visit to Constantinople in 957. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, formally accepted baptism in 988, likely in exchange for military aid and marriage into the Byzantine imperial family. This conversion reoriented the Rus toward the Orthodox Christian world. Importantly, Norse identity did not disappear. The Varangian Guard, an elite corps of Norse warriors serving in Constantinople, remained active into the 14th century. Initially composed of Rus and later expanded to include Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians, the Guard symbolized the Norsemen's enduring martial prestige and their place within broader imperial systems. To summarize, the eastern expansion of Norse influence was characterized by diplomacy, trade, settlement, and cultural synthesis. It culminated in the rise of Kievan Rus, a state born of Viking initiative, sustained by Slavic populations, and integrated into the Christian and Byzantine spheres. Let us now move into the final century of what is traditionally recognized as the Viking Age, spanning from the mid-10th to mid-11th century, when Norse activity transformed from decentralized raiding to centralized, dynastic politics. This phase saw the Norse embedded within the Christian kingdoms of Europe as dukes, kings, and even emperors. Nowhere is this shift more evident than in the cases of Normandy and England, culminating in the fateful year of 1066. We begin with Normandy. In 911, Viking chieftain Hrolf, better known as Rollo in Latinized Frankish sources, entered into an agreement with Charles the Simple, king of West Francia. According to the annals of Saint Vaast and Dudo of Saint Quintin, this treaty, known as the Treaty of Saint Clair-sur-Epte, granted Rollo dominion over the lower Seine valley in exchange for loyalty and conversion to Christianity. Rollo was baptized as Robert and became the first Duke of Normandy. His followers settled and intermarried with the local Frankish population, adopting Christianity, the French language, and feudal customs. However, as historian Eleanor Searle notes, they retained a distinct martial and legal identity for generations. Under the leadership of Richard I and Richard II, the duchy grew into a powerful, semi-independent principality. The Normans developed strong ties with the church, constructed monasteries, and patronized Romanesque architecture. Their hybrid warrior aristocracy, part Norse, part Frankish, played a crucial role in shaping northern France's political and military landscape. Turning now to England, where Viking influence never truly disappeared. Following the reign of Athelstan, Anglo-Saxon consolidation faced renewed threats from Scandinavia. The 990s saw aggressive campaigns led by Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, prompted in part by the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when King Athelred ordered the killing of Danes across England. Sweyn's invasions culminated in his brief seizure of the English throne in 1013, though he died soon after. His son, Knut the Great, succeeded in conquering and ruling England by 1016. Over the next 2 decades, Knut presided over what modern historians call the North Sea Empire, a personal union of England, Denmark, and eventually Norway. Knut legitimized his rule through both policy and marriage. He wed Emma of Normandy, widow of Athelred, retained the Anglo-Saxon legal system, issued law codes, and actively supported monastic reform. He ruled as a Christian king, minted coins with his likeness, and maintained close ties with the papacy. Despite its apparent strength, the North Sea Empire was short-lived. Following Knut's death in 1035, succession disputes fractured the realm. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut struggled to retain control, and England eventually returned to Anglo-Saxon hands under Edward the Confessor in 1042. Edward, Athelred and Emma's son, had spent years in exile in Normandy. His reign was heavily influenced by Norman customs, clergy, and advisors. Upon his death in January 1066 without an heir, a succession crisis unfolded that would bring 3 rival claimants to the English throne: Harold Godwin's son, Edward's brother-in-law and leading Anglo-Saxon noble, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. Harold Hardrada, whose name means hard ruler, was a battle-hardened monarch with years of military service in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. His invasion of England, aided by Tostig Godwin's son, Harold's exiled brother, achieved a temporary victory at the Battle of Fulford near York. However, only days later, on September 25, 1066, he was decisively defeated and killed by Harold Godwinson's forces at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This clash is widely regarded as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. Yet the story did not conclude there. Just 3 weeks later, William of Normandy invaded from the south. On October 14, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, Harold Godwin's son was killed, and William emerged victorious. Though the Normans were by now linguistically and culturally French, their distant Scandinavian roots remained embedded in their identity. The conquest of England introduced new administrative structures, reshaped aristocratic landholding, and accelerated the integration of England into the broader feudal matrix of Western Europe. To summarize, the twilight of the Viking Age was marked not by raids but by rulership. Norsemen had ceased to be mere outsiders, they had become kings and lords, shaping the political destinies of nations. Through marriage, conquest, and religious conversion, they embedded themselves into European governance, military institutions, and cultural memory. The defeats of Harold Hardrada and Harold Godwin's son in 1066 did not simply end a chronological era. They marked the passing of a distinctive mode of life, of seaborne warfare, decentralized power, and pagan cosmology, replaced by the Christian monarchies of medieval Europe. Let us now take a final turn, not into another region or century, but into the afterlife of the Viking Age. For while the age of raids, runestones, and royal ascension drew to a close by the 11th century, its memory endured, refracted through medieval chronicles, romantic nationalism, and modern popular culture. The earliest efforts to record and interpret the Viking past came from within the Norse world itself. In 13th-century Iceland, saga writers such as Snorri Sturluson composed works like Heimskringla, a chronicle of Norwegian kings from mythic origins to the High Middle Ages. Though based in part on oral traditions and skaldic poetry, Snorri's writings were shaped by Christian ideology and the political concerns of his time. They are, as much as they are history, works of cultural curation and selective memory. Other Icelandic texts, collectively known as the Islandingasogur, or sagas of Icelanders, offer intricate portraits of society during the Viking Age. Texts like Egil's saga or Njal's saga depict a world governed not by kings but by law, family honor, and individual cunning. Yet these sagas, written generations after the Viking Age had ended, reflect a post-conversion worldview, shaped by Christian ethics and medieval legal reform, more nostalgic than documentary. Voiceover, pause. In Western Europe, the Viking legacy took a very different form. Christian chroniclers, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, and Irish, portrayed Viking incursions as divine punishment and apocalyptic trauma. Alcuin of York, writing in the aftermath of the Lindisfarne raid of 793, famously asked, "What meaneth this, that the heathen have come to God's church?" For such writers, the Norsemen were the scourge of God, agents of chaos and unbelief, meant to chastise a sinful Christendom. This ecclesiastical framing defined the medieval image of the Viking, a violent, godless barbarian. It endured for centuries, shaping how Viking heritage was remembered, or forgotten, in England, France, and even Rus. In Normandy, Norse identity was quickly assimilated into Frankish nobility. In Kievan Rus, the Varangian origins of its dynasty were gradually replaced by narratives of Slavic ethnogenesis. Yet archaeology preserved what texts omitted. Ship burials at Oseberg, Gokstad, and Ladby, treasure hoards at Querdale and Spillings, runestones etched across the Scandinavian countryside, these silent witnesses retained their meaning even when unspoken. Not until the rise of modern archaeology in the 19th century were these voices truly heard again. It was during the Romantic era that the Vikings experienced their most dramatic resurrection. In 18th and 19th century Scandinavia, historians and antiquarians, such as Carl Christian Raffn, began collecting, publishing, and translating the sagas. These works, once regarded as folkloric curiosities, were now reframed as national epics. Norse heroes were recast as noble ancestors, courageous, self-reliant, and bound by honor. Painters like Johann Christian Dahl and poets like Esaias Tegner helped shape this image. In England, writers like Thomas Warton and William Morris incorporated Norse themes into their poetry and design. Wagner's Ring Cycle, drawn from both Norse and Germanic myth, brought Viking imagery to the opera house, embedding it in the cultural consciousness of Europe. This reinvention, however, was not without danger. In 20th-century Germany, Norse myth and Viking symbolism were appropriated by fascist ideologues. Nazi propagandists invoked the Vikings as racial progenitors, symbols of martial purity and Aryan destiny. Such distortions would taint the academic study of Norse culture for decades to come. Voiceover, pause. In recent years, the Viking Age has enjoyed a renewed wave of public fascination. Television series like Vikings and The Last Kingdom, video games like Assassin's Creed, Valhalla, and popular novels have introduced Viking themes to millions worldwide. These portrayals often blend myth with historical fact, compressing timelines and enhancing drama, but they have also revitalized public interest in Norse history. Academic research has responded in kind. Advances in bioarchaeology, genetic studies, and isotopic analysis have revealed a more complex Viking world, multicultural, mobile, and deeply interconnected. DNA testing of Viking-era burials shows admixture with Celtic, Slavic, and Baltic populations. Women, once overlooked, are now recognized as traders, settlers, and sometimes warriors. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age is no longer viewed solely as a time of destruction. Scholars now emphasize its role in state formation, legal development, religious transformation, and global exchange. The Viking ship, once feared as a vessel of death, is increasingly seen as a symbol of innovation and connectivity. Voiceover, brief pause. To conclude this documentary, the Viking Age was not a single phenomenon. It was a period of transformation, violent and creative, local and global. Its actors were not merely raiders or kings, but farmers, craftsmen, women, poets, and merchants, participants in a sweeping historical drama that stretched from the North Atlantic to Baghdad, from the Danelaw to Byzantium. Its legacy lives on, in law codes, in language, in landscape, and in memory. As with the echoes of longships across the fjords, the voices of the Viking Age have not been lost. They have merely changed form, passed down, reshaped, and remembered. Let us now return to silence, much like the fjords of Norway, where wind and water still speak more quietly than kings ever did.